your questions and comments in the chat. And then he'll be taking your questions if you also would like to speak and share with him. Sounds great. All right, then let's go. I'm very excited to hear this. Good luck. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Go ahead.
Does everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome, great. Okay, so I'll share my screen and then we'll get started. All right, so my name is Matthew. I'm a lead product designer now at SwiftConnect. It's a new position I started recently at the company, but essentially it's very similar to UI UX, which is very relevant for this presentation. So a bit about me. Like I just mentioned, I'm a lead designer at SwiftConnect. I am a former student of LaSalle College, so I graduated in 2018 in computer science. After graduating, I started my career as a front-end developer. I did that for about a year and a half, and then I transitioned to a designer, where I've been doing that ever since. So I haven't touched much code in the last, I would say, year and a half to 2 years, even though I've been a designer for longer. But yeah, that's where I am right now, and it's a really good transition, and it was something I kind of always knew I was going to do once I left LaSalle College. Another fun fact about me is that I'm one of the original members of INT, remember the club that you guys have at school, and I'm also the one that designed the logo. So the logo that you guys see around the school and probably on T-shirts and stuff like that, I'm one of the people that designed it. So that's also another fun fact about who I am. Throughout my years, well, my short career, especially starting as a developer and transitioning to a designer, I realized that there's a lot of correlation between the design team and the developing team, and they really work tightly together. And often people that are in design either come from a graphic background or come from a background of a technical background in computer science, and their way of tackling design varies. One is a lot more technical, coming from the design side, the technical side of computer science, and then there's one that is a bit more creative. But they both have really good sides in a company. But I think the advantage of somebody that comes from a developing background is that they're able to understand a bit more of how developers work. And that's the purpose of this presentation, and hopefully you guys learn a bit from that. So before starting, I'd like to explain what design is in terms of IT. So design is really simple. It's the design of a product before the developers or the engineering team starts on it. In a larger term, design could also be used for marketing purposes. It could be used for investment purposes if you're a startup. It could be used for the back end. It could be used for architectural purposes. But in very general, traditional terms, the design is the output for, the communication tool for a developer to create their product. In a company, this is a very simplified version of what a company would look like. But often the way it looks, a traditional company will have stakeholders, then you'll have a product team, and you have engineers, which are the developers. And the flow is that the stakeholders have a want. They tell the product team what they want. The product team just figures out how to create it, does the research needed, does all the marketing strategies, the designs that are needed. And once that's determined, then they send the designs to the engineering team, and then the engineering team creates it. And that's a very simplified version of what a company looks like. But in reality, a company is a lot more larger in scale, and there's a lot of moving parts. Some companies might have different investors, owners, different levels of management, different departments in a company. A product team could be divided into multiple roles. It could have a designer, it could have a product owner, which is somebody who oversees the whole product. They own the product. They're the go-to for whatever the product is. There's business analysts, there's software analysts, there's the marketing team that could work closely with the product team. If they work, if they are related to the product, sales could also be part of the product team. And then you have the engineering team, which is the front end, the back end. Front end could be divided into integration, which are people that work mostly on CSS and the way that things look when it comes to, let's say, a website. The quality assurance team, there's the architects, the database architects, the ones that create really the structure of the database. And a designer could work with pretty much everybody, depending on how a company is structured. But traditionally, the designer works really closely with a front-end developer or the developing team that is in the front end, the ones that work really on what the user sees, the client side of either the product, the website, the application, whatever it is. So most of the presentation is be focusing on these two user personas, but in general, a designer could really work with whoever. It really depends on how the structure of a company is and how a company is values or uses their employees. So I'll start with giving a really generic example of how a company would probably work day to day. So we have a company here that during COVID, they realized that a lot of people started baking and that really want to learn how to bake. So they decided that, hey, in our how-to application, we're going to teach people how to bake. And one of the things we're going to teach them how to bake is sourdough. We created these really beautiful mock-ups and these prototypes, and everything's really looks really nice, and it's ready for production. We need just to develop it. So as a design team, we send it to the developers, and the developers start to work on it. And then the developers start asking questions, and they say, hey, I realize that the button that we use here is very similar to the button we use in the lesson screen. I can't tell if it's the same one. And then you get a ticket on Jira, which is a project management tool. There's a ton of them. And they say, that image is really big. How are we going to load it? And do we put a loading cursor on it? And then you get more. What happens when the screen resizes to something that's smaller? How are we supposed to take it into consideration? I realized that your font was 14 pixels on one section and 17 pixels in another section. I don't know what to do if your internet doesn't work. Am I supposed to do, what states am I supposed to take into consideration? And you get all these questions as a designer, and then before you know it, you're not really designing and you're answering more questions, which get very frustrating. But it is actually very common in a company that the developers don't see things the way that you do, and what happens is that they have a bunch of questions. And the reason why is because often designers design their mock-ups and prototypes to be a final output, when in reality they should be a design communication tool for your developers. And what I mean by that is the final product is not the mock-up, and it's not the designs that you created. The final product is the software that is going to be created by the developers. That's what users and clients are going to use. All you're doing is communicating with the developers of what they should be doing. And by doing that, you should give all the information that is relevant to them, and so that they could create that final output. So that being said, the design files are mostly, almost always, the source of truth. And what that means is that they're always the go-to to know what a product should look like. So your design files should be the communication tool, but they also are the final look or design of what a product should look like. One way that a developer and a designer could work together and making sure that things really look the same and work together is by using the concept of components. Now, later on in the presentation, I'll show you guys what a design system is. And this is something that is used in a lot of large companies. We use it at Swift Connect as well. Some design systems are created by third parties. Some design systems are created by the company itself. It's another word that could be used for design system, which is an older way of looking at it, is a style guide. But it's essentially a a representation of what things should look like and how they should be used. And one way that we use designs, and the concept of component is actually created by developers. If any of you have worked with front-end frameworks like React, Angular, Vue.js, their concept is pretty much built off of creating components. And that's where design and developers could really work hand in hand, because there's a way to mirror how your design matches code. So for those who don't know what a component is, a component is it's a part of a program or a construction, and it's really building blocks. It's how you create a screen. It's how you create a section. It's often things that are reused, and they could always have the same style or same look, and it's to also create consistency. So when we look at the screen on the right, it's a very generic home screen for a mobile app, but essentially what this screen is, it's a bunch of different components, and components could be small, components can be big, components could be created by other components as well, and this applies for design as well as it applies for developers. So when we look at the screen, the navigation on top over here is a component. The date picker is a different component. The card is a component, but within the card, there's another component, which is the avatar icon. And technically, the text could also be a component. This could be considered as a header text, which would be created as a component so that every header text looks the same. And this could be your description. And what it does is that it creates consistency, and it just creates like a very fast way of reusing stuff. And this applies for developers and for designers. So what I'd like to do is go through why it's practical to design as a developer, and why it's practical for developers, to have a common relationship with the designer. A few tricks of how we could do it, when it's needed for a designer to do it, and mostly when it shouldn't be done, because sometimes it's not necessarily always needed to create components and all these things. And then what do we do from here? And I'll start by talking about why. And the main reason is really having a source of shared language. Right here, you see an example of what so the software being used from here is Figma, which is a designing software, but there's so many out there. Adobe Xd is maybe one that you guys know. There's InVision. There's really a lot of tools that work in the same way, and that allow you to create components. And then on the bottom is a source of code that is used in React. And as you can
Matthew, I don't know if you can hear me. You froze.
I froze.
Yeah, now you're back. It's good.
Okay. I'm gonna just try something to help out. Do you guys see my screen or hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Sorry about that.
No problem.
So back to what we were saying is there is really a way to have shared languages. Now, I don't know if you guys have, maybe some of you don't know what React is or Angular and what these different languages are. They're really it's libraries that are used for front-end developers. And if ever any of you become front-end developers or decide to do that in your career, chances are you're going to be using one of these, and they're really, really good tools to create really consistent products, easy products to use as a client, but it's also very easy to translate between design and code. So that's the number one reason, is that they're shared languages. The other thing too is that as an engineer, or sorry, as a designer, you're able to give them one place that they can find all their details. So right here we have a ticket, which is the task that the person's going to work on as a developer, and they have to implement the lesson card. So as a designer, instead of just telling them, this is what it should look like, as a designer, you should think about all the different states that a developer would probably have to develop. So this is what it looks like as a default state. This is what it looks like when you hover over this card. When you click on this card, this is what I would like for it to look like when it focuses. This is what it should look like as it's completed. These here are variants of a component created as a designer, but it translates 100% to what a developer would do, because a developer would create all these different types of states. And then over here, it's even more information for a developer to work with. A developer would probably want to know what type of font to use, which are part of the design system. So everything that you see in purple is a component. So this icon is a component. This text is a component. This other text, the subtitle, is a component. And the developers already know that these are components in their library, and it's easier for them to create this new component, which is called a lesson card, by using other things that already exist. And you could give more information about what happens when it eases, what you want to do when you click. Should it expand? Should it go from left to right? All these different behaviors that are really, really relevant for a developer. So the engineers and the developers have one place to find all these details. And another thing too is that tools like Figma and Adobe Xd, they create links. So the developer just has to click on a link, he gets to this file and he sees all these things. Another place that makes it really, really practical is that often in large companies especially, so I'll give you an example of a company like Spotify. Spotify is huge. They have multiple products, multiple departments, and most designers, like usually you have a role. So if you're a UI designer, you're only a UI designer. If you're a UX designer, you're only a UX designer. But they might have people that work on the design system team. They might have people that work in content, which is like what should be written. You might have an art director that says, hey, this thing, I don't like this picture, it should be another one. So there's also a source of collaboration by using these tools, because not only developers could use it, and this is where I brought in the fact that other people could use it. And by creating these components, it's easy to modify one section because it's almost a source of truth for that specific instance. So this card, as you can see, the structure is the same. It's just different information is being used at the inside of it. If Anna, the art director, says, hey, I don't want to use this picture, it's easy to change it using tools like Figma and stuff like that. Another thing that's really practical is that it updates your mockups automatically. So tools like React and developers, with time, when you develop, you're going to learn how to use variables and things that repeat. It's very, like, software is made for that. Software is easily done in a way that you could create one variable that repeats throughout your whole software. And if you have to modify it at one place, it modifies everywhere. And if you design as a developer would develop, it makes things easy as well. Because if you create instances and components in your design, it's easy to modify things like this. If your head of content decides that they don't want to use the word play, they want to use the word watch video. Well, if this watch video component is being used in 76 different sections of your design, and if you created this as a component, by modifying the master, it modifies everywhere else. And that translates exactly like how a developer would do. And I'll be able to show you guys how that works later in the tools. So that's another advantage of designing like a developer, is that you're able to automatically update your mockups. So now this is the how. You get a lot of information and you don't know how to use it. So this is one of the ways that I structure my design files, and I learned this with time and working with the front end team and different developers. And this is really the way that our team likes to use things and do things. And brings up to this point is that by talking to your team, you're able to learn how developers work. Designers are able to learn how developers work. Developers learn how designers work. You're able to share knowledge. And seeing that I haven't developed in 2 years, when I was a front end developer, I didn't use React. I used Angular, and React is very similar, but there is certain differences that impact the way you design things. And being able to talk to my developers and figure out like a common knowledge, we were able to build a trust, and we were able to build a platform that is able to make products and our projects go a lot more smoother because we're all on the same page. The way I like to structure my code or my design, is by these 3 building blocks. So everything should start as a component if it's possible. If you're creating a new component, so example, this lesson card is new for this section, the component should be created first. Everything should be detailed, all the different states, all the different functionalities, because that's really what a developer wants to know. And then once those components are created, then I go create the views. And the views is really how it should look, the layout. And then once that's done, I create the prototypes of how the app should actually work and the behavior. So we'll start with the components. A bit like you guys saw before, these are all the different states. This is all, what happens when it expands flex space over here, meaning that, if it's responsive, I want this to stay on the left, I want this to stay on the right, and the space in between is what should grow. Now, views is where the way a developer will structure their code could relate very closely to how you structure your design. So right here we have the core section, which is this whole section here, and then I have a banner video which is on my right, and then I have all my lessons, which is put into a component. And this component is an instance of all these lesson cards. So by looking at it as a developer, you're able to see how I kind of structured it as a designer. And then you're able to see that I'm using this lesson card component, which we created over here already. And by calling it lesson card, you're also telling the developer, hey, maybe it's a good idea that you call it lesson card. And in the future, if ever we decide to use a lesson card component, it already exists and the structure is already done. And then if you did your components properly and you created your views properly, especially by using real data, the reason why you should use real content and real information is that it makes it a lot more realistic of what it should look like. And it also attacks different issues of, what happens if your label is too long? Should it take 1 line, 2 lines? What happens if the description is longer than the component? You tackle all these different scenarios. And if you did the 2 first steps properly, prototyping is really easy because all you have to do is just connect your sections to the other. So those are the three go-to pillars in the way that we structure our design apps to connect. And there's a lot of different companies that do it this way as well. This is kind of like a go-to structure for a lot of different companies. So I'm giving you all these information, but you feel like it's a lot, and I did at first too. And the other thing too is that a lot of people that I talk about designing as code and not the other way around, they feel like it's a lot of work. And it is. Creating design systems is a lot of work, especially if you create it from scratch. But there's ways of tackling it that it's not, that you don't need to use components. There's ways of doing things that you don't need to make a final output. And this is where the when is really used. So there's the never, sometimes, and always analogy. And you should never create components and never create, and this is mostly speaking as a designer, you should never create components and all these type of like very detailed content when you're exploring. Exploration should be used, pen to paper, using a whiteboard. Often, exploration is at the beginning of a project. The beginning of a product could also be done with stakeholders. So that's where, really keeping it simple helps your ideas. If there's existing patterns, what that means is that if there's existing components and you need to update and stuff like that, you should take into consideration updating existing components, adding to existing components. But where you should always create components is when it's a new feature. When there's something new in a product, developers always want to know how it's structured, and you as a designer as well. The advantage is, in most cases, everything is returned from the back end, and you don't have control on what is being outputted. So if you're displaying a table and there's no information displayed, you need to take that into consideration, that there might be no users in that table. There might not be any, in a store. Let's say I'm on Amazon and I search something, it's possible that that product doesn't exist. Well, Amazon's going to return a state saying, hey, this doesn't exist. And that's considered to be an empty state. So by creating components as a designer, you're also able to take in consideration all the states that you're missing, so that you don't get bombarded with all these questions from your developers. One of the other questions I get often too is, should designers code, especially since I started my career as a developer? And I wouldn't say it's necessary. And especially these are questions that I've gotten from conversations I had with graphic designers that transition their career to UI UX, or people that just learn from either a product side, or if they came from business analysts or something along those lines. And I wouldn't say that you should learn how to code, but you should understand what the other person, what tools they're using and how things are structured. So you don't need to know how React works. You don't need to know how Angular works. You don't need to know any front end language. You just need to have an understanding of how they structure things. And by having an understanding of how things structured, you're able to design in that way. And I think as developers, which I think most of you will become, it's more practical if you understand how your designers work, so that there's an understanding of how they're creating their designs, and it's easier as a developer to understand what means what, and understand what they're trying to output for you. So by talking with your team, it creates trust, but it also, that shared knowledge, it's really what's important, because not everybody is good at design and not everybody's good at code, but having an understanding really makes your product work much better, and it makes things a lot more efficient, which is really what's important. You, as a developer, you don't want to spend time wasting trying to figure out what they meant. If that designer is able to put all that information from the beginning, it really makes the transition a lot easier. Another section over here is in the structure of the component. Some things might change. You might want to input different things. So you might not want to use a lesson card. You might use something else. As a designer, if you're using a component that already exists and you've created that structure, so let's say we don't want to use a lesson card and we want to use a description card. If that already exists in your code, well, it's easy for the designer to change it on their side because that component already exists. And then the developers only have to go change it in that section. So that's another example of why having the same together is really practical. So now this is the what's next. Ideally, if you're planning on becoming a front-end developer, I would recommend learning these frameworks as components and understanding the basis of what a component is. But understanding how a component works will really help you understand how designers design. And if you're a designer, I recommend learning about design systems and seeing how they work, because as I'll show you later, they're really powerful tools, and they're as important for developers as they are for designers, and they're really important for everyone in the company. The marketing team might use it to know what colors are what. The content team might use it to find out what type of how many characters we could fit in this specific component. It's used throughout the whole company, which is really powerful. So that's it. That's how you should really think about designing as a team, and not only as a designer, and developers, implementing your developers, and finding out how all these different moving parts in the company really actually work quite close to each other. And if once you figure that out, and I recommend you do it in projects at school. That's how I kind of started my passion for design, is that I wasn't really the best uh, developer in school. It wasn't really my strong point, but I was really good at was understanding business values and how the product would be used by others and the user perspective of things. And when I made projects with teams, I was able to use that side, and that's how I was able to have projects or our homework, let's say, be really good, because I added a perspective to teams or to developers that they weren't really comfortable with. So there's always ways of using this, even in your everyday school. Find somebody that's really good in design. Find somebody that's really good in developing if you're not a developer, and create mini projects. Create little things. Um, you'll see it'll really expand your views as a designer and as well as a developer. And that's really what everyday life, working as a front end developer, even back end developers, you really use design a lot, especially if you're in a software based company. So that's part for the presentation. Right now, I'll jump into Figma. Before that, I just want to make sure I see you guys, your comments, if there's any. So let me jump into Figma. So one of the things that I want to talk about is design systems. Now, I would be very most of you have probably already seen a design system, just don't know that it's called the design system. And one of the most common design systems, and if ever you guys take the Android class, I don't know if it's still taught, but in the Android class, you guys use Android, which uses material design, and all these buttons are part of a design system. So in Figma, you're able to access these design systems by these companies. You have access to them through Adobe Xd as well. You have access to them through pretty much all the big design softwares. And this is practical for developers as well. And what that means is that all these components, which are components, have these type of instances. So, this is exactly given by Google. Google puts this on Figma. As you can see over here, it's called Material 3, which is the new design, their new version that came out recently, I think about a week ago. And what's cool about this is that it creates all these different states. So if I'm a designer, I create these states, and then I say, okay, this is what I want it to look like when it's enabled, disabled, pressed, etc. I give these to the developers, and the developers create these as components in React or Angular or whatever front end tool they're using. Same thing for mobile. If they're using native applications, they would create this as well on their side. You could create these using generic CSS as well. You could create components using less Sass, all these front end CSS frameworks. Variables is really what it is. It's different variations of a component. And what's cool about these is that it's really a structure of what it's a building block for a website, or it's a building block for an application. So as you see over here, these are all the different type of buttons. This is what happens when it's on light mode. This is what Google does when it's on dark mode. This is what a card looks like. Same thing for light and dark. This is what an input chip is. So like input chips is like badges. So a toast could be considered one of these as well. They use this often in mobile. There's a bunch of different components that are already predetermined by Google. And a lot of developing companies that don't have necessarily the budget to work with a big design or product team, they will use design systems like this. So, one of the first places I worked at, I was the only designer, and there was a lot of developers. So it was a lot more strategic for me to use a design system like material design, because the components are already created. and the framework is public. The developers just have to implement it in their project. And if I tell them, hey, I want to use button hover, well, it translates exactly how a developer would see it. So all they have to do is call button hover example. And these are also available on the website. So if I were to go on material design, and I went under the component section, this is exactly what, once it loads, is exactly what we saw on Figma. And while this is loading, I'll show you another tool, which is called Adele. And this is all the different design systems that big companies use. So, Dropbox, their design system is called Scooter. Mozilla Firefox using Phantom. Trello has Nacho. Big companies, every big company has a design system, and most of these design systems are public. So you could use them in your own projects, and you could also look and see how they're created. You can inspect them, see how they're created, what's the different styles. So even as the developers, if you want to create your own project and do something cool, look at design systems, because that's what big companies use, and it's always pretty much used. Almost every company uses it now, and if they don't, they use a variation of it. So yeah, you see the app, the banners, the buttons. This is an exact translation of what you see over here. So what I want to do is jump into Figma and start designing. So by the way, the presentation I made was using Figma. I'll share this at the end if you guys want to look at it. But Figma is also good for using other things, not only for design. So one of the design systems that I like using when I make projects outside of work. At work, I created my own design system when I started. The developers and I decided that we had enough bandwidth to create our own. And with the type of product that we developed, it was more efficient for us to create our own, because we have very specific things that are not generic to design systems. But almost every company uses something along those lines, whether it's created or external. So the design system that I'm going to share with you guys is AntDesign. AntDesign is a very well-known design system for React developers. They also take in consideration mobile and stuff like that. So if I open this, as you can see, these are all the different components that are already created by Ant. And if I were to go over here and use a button, well, the advantage of this on Figma is that it's set up in a certain way, a bit like they do it in material design, that all these states are determined. So as a designer, if I want this button to be the secondary state, all I have to do is come here, and change this to the default, which is their secondary state. And if I want it to be a danger button, which is usually red, I just have to click on it and it's done. So if I were to create something really, really simple, like a form, so what I'll do is I'll go over here, actually take these inputs, and I want to create a form for entering somebody's address. So it's, instead of having to create everything by myself, creating, like going into this section over here, creating a rectangle and then changing the colors, adding text, making it really, long, you create it as a component first. And then what happens is that you're able to do all these different variations. And, if I want it filled, if I wanted to have a icon at the beginning, and I want this to be called enter your name, well, it took me 2 seconds to do it. And I could make a duplication of this, and maybe I want this to be a phone number. So I would access the component library of icons, which is part of AntDesign. I would search phone. I would click on phone, and then I would change this to phone number. So enter your phone number. Add this as a button. Have this as, let's say, a save. Have this as a cancel, let's say. In Figma, it was created by developers for designers. So the reason why I use Figma is because it's very, very closely related to how a developer would develop stuff, even in our tools. So I'm able to create components very fast, but it allows me to do like auto layouts, which is the equivalent of Flex in HTML syntax, I guess, or CSS syntax. So if I wanted this guy to be the primary, and this is a cancel, and I want this all to be in a component with, I don't know, let's say this guy to the right, and it takes up the whole space. So this would be like having something like flex. And then I want it to have a background with a padding. So right here, you can determine your padding. So let's say I want the padding to be 24, and I want the background to be white, and that it has like a nice shadow effect. So I come here in effects, and I have a shadow effect. And it took me 2 seconds to create a component, which before having design systems would probably taken me half an hour to an hour to create. And what's cool about this is that it's not only associated to things like your buttons, but it's also associated to things like text. So that's why before I said you could have header text and all these different types of things, because when it come over here, these are all different components of text styles that are already created. So if I don't want this to be 16 pixel, I can make it 14 pixel, and the component responds to the way I want it. And if I don't want the text to be black, but I want it to be blue, if these components, these variables are already created in your design system and they're determined, and your developers have an exact copy of what this is, it makes things really, really easy. And you see, so now it's blue. And if I don't want this button to be blue and I want it to be, let's say, orange, it really took me 2 seconds to change it. Now, where things like this get really, really fun is if you create, when you change it on a larger scale. So I'm going to create my own component just to show you guys how it works. So let's say I'm going to create a button. I'm going to create a button, and I want it to have a border with a background, and I want the background to be, let's say, red. Okay. Now over here in Figma, and this is the same thing for Adobe Xd, it allows me to create a component. So now I have this component. So let's say I use this component over here, and this guy over here. So now I'm using this new button that I created, and I made a bunch of different copies of this guy. So let's say I make it like this. And let's say over here, for some reason, we decided that and this could be used throughout a whole design system. So for some reason, we decided that we don't like the button to be red, and we want all our buttons to now be blue. Well, if we go with the concept of a component and how the developers would do it, is that the developers would go into the component, they would change the button color from red to blue, and it would translate throughout the whole website, or throughout the whole application, or throughout the whole product. But in the design is that if I create my component, and this is the example I was giving before, is that this is a new button, this is a component. I create it as a component, and then I take that component and I implement it in my design. Well, if I change this from red to blue, well, it changes throughout your whole application. And that's why it's really, really powerful to also design as a developer, because that notion of components and variables and how these things are created, it allows you to really, really create powerful design. And that if ever you made a mistake, or for some reason marketing decides that all our buttons should be this color because of a certain reason. Another reason could be that the design that you made doesn't pass accessibility, which is something as a front-end developer you'll have to test. Accessibility is like there's certain grades that you have to pass for your website to be legal. So the contrast between this blue and white is this black and blue is not strong enough. Somebody that has color visual issues or sees color in certain tones, they wouldn't be able to see this. So all I would have to do is go to my component and now change the text from black to white, and it changes everywhere throughout my application. And this is a really, really simplified version of why these components and these structures are really, really powerful. And if I wanted, if I thought that this form component was going to be reused in multiple sections, I would also create it as a component. So then I would create this as a component. I would call this, let's say, address form or person form, and I would use it in different sections. And then if that person in another, so let's say person form is over here, and if somebody said, hey, we don't want it to be enter your name, we want it to be enter your full name, well, by modifying it on the component, it modifies on the instance of that component. I think that's a good example of why the designing to code and vice versa works really, really well. If you want, I'll open it up to questions, and I'll be more than happy to answer them.
I think maybe because they're not doing this at the same time, they might have questions limited to just watching you do this. I actually had a question. The software you're using, is it free?
Yeah, it's free. And what's really, really cool about Figma is that it's web-based as well. So let me show you guys. If I go to Figma over here, this is, I wouldn't be able to show you guys that, but if I go to Figma, it shows the same output. Yeah, it's going to show my work stuff, but it shows the same output of as you see in the app. So what's cool about this is that if I decided to come over here and share this with with everybody here, I copy the link and I bring it to the website, it really shows it as a carbon copy. And what's cool about Figma is that you could follow people, you could communicate with people through the application. So if I were to click on, let's say, my avatar, it would follow me throughout wherever I am. And that's why I personally like using Figma. Adobe Xd does very similar things. It's just Figma is easily translated for developers. And one thing that I like to show you actually is that Figma has the inspect tool. So this is where, and this is probably the biggest thing for developers, is that if you were to come to something like, here, let me go back to this over here. And this is actually something that could be really practical for developers as well. If I were to click on a button, so let's say I want to know how the CSS for this specific button and how Google decided to create it. Well, when you create it as an inspect, it shows you all the CSS properties of how this button is actually created, and it translates exactly for one of how CSS is done. So as a designer, I could put descriptions of what I wanted to do. I could put documentation. I could do all these different things. And then as a developer, you're able to see these in code structure. So, if you guys are taking front-end classes or when you take a front-end class, you'll learn about CSS and all these different variables and how things are structured. You don't need to know how Figma works to be able to know how the code is structured, because Figma returns everything for you. So, there's value in multiple ways. In the design system, Google calls this color, system light primary, but the hex code is 675084. And that might be relevant information for you, because you might want to recreate this exact same button using CSS for learning purposes. And that's where Figma is really good about that. Another thing that's really cool about Figma is that if I go back to the example that I gave you guys over here, if I put this as an inspect tool, it gives me really, really relevant information. So it's giving me the size of the card itself. It's telling me what the padding of that card is. So, that's really, really needed information for when you design something or when you develop something. It's telling me that it's using Flex because I use the concept of auto layout. And then as a designer, as a developer, I could go even deeper into the component. So I could click on this. And when I look over here, it's telling me that I'm using a basic input because that's what the component is called. But what it does is that it gives me red lines of telling me how it's padded, how it's structured. It's telling me that the space between this component and this component is 15 pixels. It's telling me that the space between this component and this component is 8 pixels. And this is really, really valuable information for the way a product is developed, because the like I said before, the code or the output that is created by developers is what needs to be the final product, but the source of truth is the design. So if the designer says that this should be 8 pixels, the developer should create it as an 8 pixel. Same thing for this over here. I know it's a lot of information. It's probably a lot more advanced than what you guys thought, but what I would say is take a look at these different type of design systems, because I promise you, you might not be learning it at school, which is fine because it's a fairly newer concept, but it is something that you will use if ever you decide to become a front-end developer, or if you decide to change your career and go into UI UX, you decide to become a business analyst, something along those lines. There's probably somewhere in the company, probably just not backend, but somewhere in the company you'll be using these assets and wanting to know what these colors are, and it's really, really practical for designers and developers.
Matthew, there's quite a few questions now in the chat.
Yeah.
So I'll read them to you one by one. You can answer, then I'll move to the next one. So how did you install the and design? I'm not sure if it's supposed.
That's a great question. So I'll show you the way it works. All right. So if I go to Figma Community, which is here, let me do this. So if I go to Community, this is the Figma Community. So in Figma, and Adobe Xd has it very similar. They have it in sections. So, design system is a section. So if you click on design system, you would be able to find these design systems. What happens is that I'll give you an example as material design. So I open material design, which you guys have over here. If I save this into my projects and I have it as in my environment, when I go to a new project, like what I was creating over here, in the assets file, assets is really everything that you're inputting. So all the components, all the colors, all the different things, you're able to open up your library and you're able to see all the different assets that are being used. So because I didn't save I didn't save material design, I don't see it, but I did save Ant. And you see Foop design system is our personal in-house design system. So if I were to open this, you would be able to see all the buttons that I created, all the different avatars and stuff like that. So, like if I come here and I implement it, this is the button that we personally use in our application. These are the icons that we personally use in our application. So you could either download your own design system and implement it into a project, or you could create your own file and then save it and then implement it. So if I were to show you Foop, see if I opened our design system, which we call Foop, and this is an example of all our variables. So we determine our text in advance so that there's no complication of what should be what. Is it normal IC17? Is it normal IC16? It's detailed. It's created so that the developers don't have to ask these questions. All they need to know is that they're going to use the body text. So all these things are created, essentially the colors as well. It's saved on this side, and then when I use it into the application, it updates. And what's cool about things like this is that if I were to update it over here, save it, and then update it on this side. So let's say I were to, here, I could probably do it quick. Let's say I want this to no longer be blue, and I want the accent color to be red, okay? I would come here, it would tell me, hey, there was a modification. Do you want to save it? So it should allow me to publish. There you go. Update all, no. Anyways, it would update it, and then I would come over here, and then the blue that was being used wouldn't be blue anymore, it would be red. I don't know why it's not updating. It's probably because I have a lot of files open, but that's how it would work. So in big companies like Spotify, there's a design system company, the design system team. All they do is work on the design system. All they do is care about this section here, making sure that it's relevant, it's up to date. So if they decide that they don't want this purple to be purple anymore, they want it to be, I don't know, green, they update it here, they press save, and it's imported to all their different sections. So if they have 170 different products using this purple, and now it's no longer purple, it's green, it's updated throughout everything.
Perfect. Thank you, Matthew. I have a question, actually, just since you're talking about that before taking the next question. Can you download existing themes for a website or a mobile app without having to start from scratch and just customize it with the colors, sizes, and text and fonts? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
And that comes in Figma.
Yeah. So let's say I want to use material design. I have a company. Material design is open source, so you can use it as you wish. It's there's no like rights related to it. So let's say as a company, I want to use material design. So I download this file and I create my own version of it. But we don't want the color to be. I think a good example would be the color. So if I come over here into my colors, I could modify the selected color. So let's say I say I don't want this. I don't know if it'll work, this example. We'll try it. So if I say that I don't want this to be, or this guy here, primary would be example. I don't want it to be purple, and I want it to be, what's another color that they use that I could use? Let's say black. Will it work? Yeah, you see? So it changed everything to black. So whatever was using that purple is now black, and it's throughout the whole thing. So a lot of companies, what they'll do is that they'll take, a lot of designers, they'll take these systems that they know the developers are going to work with, and they mimic their own design system on top of it. And the structure of the component stays the same. So the button padding and all that size stays the same, but they might want to use a theme that works with their company color. If their company color is black, well, they'll just change this exact existing thing. So you could modify, you could add, you could change. If I don't want my buttons to be round and I want the button to be like, I don't know, 32 or square, well, I just changed it, and wherever is being used here, it changes throughout all of them. So you see all the enabled buttons are now square, because it follows. They let you, if a design system is well built, and usually the ones that you're using from known companies are, they complement each other.
Okay, perfect. I'll go to more questions, but keep in mind a question so I don't forget it for after. Yeah. Is what are some of the approaches that you and your clients or the company where you work have gone through to decide on those designs? Is it strictly just you as a designer from your experience, or is it feedback, discussions with the clients, and at what point that happens? But keep that maybe just till after the students' questions.
Yeah, and that's a really good question.
Thanks. So Diptesh asks a question and says, which is easier to learn or more user-friendly, Adobe XD or Figma? Also, which one is more demanding in the UI UX industry? Yeah. I guess he meant to say which one is more in demand. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that a lot of companies are transitioning to Figma because, number one, it's a newer software. So not a lot of people knew about it. I would say within the last year and a half, 2 years, people are starting to transition to it. And the main reason why is because it's developers that made it. So there's a lot of emphasis on how the developers use it. The other reason why is because Adobe XD is part of like the whole suite, right? So often when you want to get Adobe XD as a company, you need to get like all the other Adobe products. And Figma is URL based, it's web based. So I would say, look, I haven't done an interview in a company in a long time, but from what I see, on the market and stuff like that, I would say people tend to like, more bigger companies are using Figma. A lot of companies do use Adobe XD though. And the reason why is because if you're in a smaller company that, doesn't have a really big budget, and your graphic designer is already using Illustrator and all these other Adobe products, by default they'll make you use Adobe Xd, which is fine because it's also a very, very good product. They are very similar products. They copied each other in certain senses. They're very, very similar. I haven't used Xd in a while, but when I did use it, let's say a year and a half ago, it was very similar to Figma. I just use Figma because of the practicality and because it's web-based and because it's very collaborative. So because my role is, I'm no longer just a designer. I work heavily with the stakeholders and different departments in my in the company. There's certain aspects that Figma is more practical for me because I'm able to iterate much quicker. Another thing that Figma has is a new tool called FigJam, which is very similar to Miro. I don't know if any of you have ever used it. It's a whiteboarding tool. So I'll show you really quickly what it looks like. It's a whiteboarding tool. So let's say you wanted to create something like a mood board or a mind map. It allows you to just create all these little things really quickly. So because it's implemented, so let's say this is like, I don't know, employee, and what happens when the employee clicks on a button and you do all these like different states. I think one of Nariman's classes teaches this, right? I think you did something like this when I was in school.
Use cases for features, yeah.
Exactly. So this is a really, really, really practical tool. And what's cool about this is that I could take this and bring it straight to Figma. So when I'm trying to determine what a product is going to look like, most of my decisions are very based on what the backend is giving me as information because of the type of product we work with. We work with a lot of we integrate with a lot of different softwares, and all these different softwares do a lot of different things. So I have a lot of puzzles, like it's a big puzzle to design what I do. So often I'll start with this, and then I'll just change it to Figma. And this is why I like Figma as well, because of this tool. But if you're asking me, start with Figma. But if you've already started with Adobe Xd, transitioning to Figma won't be hard, and vice versa. If you used Figma and you want to go to Adobe Xd, the learning curve is really, really, really small. They're very, very similar in tools.
Thank you, Matthew. I think I've also seen Adobe Xd in action, and I see some of the stuff that you have done to be much more faster, if I may say, to view results integrated. So that's really cool.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing is that I'm using tools that just make my life easy. Like a design system just makes your life easy. The only time things get complicated for me is if I have to create a new component for the design system, a new feature, a new table, something along those lines that doesn't exist. But ideally, like as a designer, your number one purpose is to think about your users. You're at the end of the day, you're designing for the user. That's why it's called user interface or user experience. But your very second close job is to make life of your developers easy as well, and making your life easy as well. And using components and design systems is really, really, really a powerful tool to make your life very, very simple. Because now the designers know where to go if they have questions. They want to know, hey, this button's supposed to do this. I just refer them to the design system because the design system answers all their questions.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Raza says that's key. Thank you. Then Ali Riza asks, how can we connect the designed UI with the coding tools?
So at the moment, I don't think there's a one-for-one. That being said, if you have used CSS or want to learn CSS, there's ways. There's really a lot of YouTube videos that explain how to translate these things. When you learn, CSS and JavaScript and all these things, those are very basic versions of the next step, I would say, for you if ever you decide to go into a front-end developer. There isn't really, like I said, a one-for-one, but the way that things are structured in the design, like using these color styles and all these things, when it comes time to creating your code, and creating these file structures, your file structures will look very similar to the design system. And if a design system is modified, it's very easy for you to modify it in your variables. That's what it's called on the code side. So if my variable here is called gold, and I decide that I don't want it to be gold anymore, and I want it to stay gold, but I don't like the shade of gold. I want it to be another shade of gold. It's very easy for me to go modify it. And you just take that hex code and you modify it on your side. You take this code here, you modify it, and it transitions throughout the application. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Then Raza asks, I have a question. The same way we have Git to show our code, do we have a platform to show our design portfolio?
That's a really, really good question. So there's actually a lot of tools that, I don't know if this explains it the same way, but it might answer his question. There's tools now that allow, so Figma has a design system, and the design system lives on our project, right? So if I come here and I see this is what it is. But the material.io is the equivalent of the developer's way of doing it. Now, material is public to the world, but there's a lot of different sites that allow you to create your own design system in code. So I'll give you guys a sneak peek of what my design system looks like at work. Here. So one of the tools we use is called Storybook. And Storybook allows you to create the code and then publish it on an app. So you see, like, I'll give you an example. Like, let's go look at buttons. So if we look at our buttons, I have, my default, I have my primary, I have my text, I have all these different buttons, all the different states, what happens when it's loading and stuff like that. As a developer, this was created, these are components that are created in React, and then they host it on Storybook. And when I click on these buttons, I could see all these different actions. So if I click on this guy, it'll work. The story is not configured to handle. Wait, let me give you something better than, here we go. So these are the different banners, right? So I could see these different actions. I could see the accessibility, and I could literally see how it's coded, if I'm not mistaken. It might be that my access is limited, but essentially what it does is that it allows me to see the documentation of how this was, show code, here it is, there you go. So this is how the component is created in React. So, they have it in a div, and the component is called a banner. And then if we went into Foop, it would be structured the same way. So the message would be called message. On click, that's part of the button. But it would be very, very similar in style. So the type is danger. It would be called type or style danger in the design system. It would be called a banner. So this is, I guess, I don't know if that answers your question, but this is the dev tool used for design systems. And all they have to do is call the banner, and it automatically updates it by itself. Like, all this is coded already for them. The same way as
Matthew, what is the platform called?
It's called Storybook. So okay. I don't know if I could go on storybook.com. Netlify is also the host. Netlify, I think it's that. Yeah, so it's Netlify. They work with all these different front-end frameworks, and it's essentially, in a very, very simple way, it's a design system made for developers with their code. And why this is really powerful for me is that as a designer, if I rarely get to see the way the component looks just as itself. So if, as a designer, you understand a bit how code works and you're able to use the inspect tool, well, if I come here and I inspect, this is the DevOps tool by Google Chrome. So the way to get to this is by either right-clicking and doing inspect, or by clicking F12. And when you click on something like this, it allows you to see, oops, sorry, wrong button. It allows you to see the code, right? So I could see, the padding that was used. I could see if the structure, the colors, all those things. And I could also, I could match it with my design system kind of do like quality assurance to make sure that they did it properly. So this is also a good tool for me as a designer to make sure that what I created as a designer was actually copied properly as a developer. So this is also another thing, as I was mentioning before, is that you don't necessarily as a designer need to know how developers work, but having little tools like, how the code works, like you don't need to know how to develop, but knowing little tools like the inspect tool, how things are structured in, you know, their syntax, it'll help you as a designer because at least you could see how things are coded. But yeah, there's a lot of these. So the equivalent of this is example this. This is just Google's own hosted, like they hosted themselves. But if you come here and you click on something like, I don't know if I would be able to look at code over here, but you see like all these little things. I implement this for the designer. So I tell the developers what they should do and all these different states. It's just that Google does it for you. So it's fun to be able to just use something that is already being used. I'm trying to see if there's a way I could look at the code. Here, let me show you Ant does it. So Ant Design is exactly like like Google. And if you go into components and I click on something like buttons, I see all the buttons over here. And this is what I created the form with, the example. And I'm able to see their code. So if I click here, it shows me the code. And I'm able to see it in React. I'm able to open up a sandbox as well. So I could actually, you know, if ever you want to learn how the code is done and structured, you could open it up in CodePen, and it literally shows you the code over here. It shows you the output. So if you want to learn how the code is structured as well, if you want to learn React, this is a really good place to start as well, because these buttons are all designed for you. You don't have to really worry about the designing. You can worry more about the learning. So Ant is a really good tool for that as well, for learning all these different states and the code and stuff like that. But it's essentially a design system.
Sorry, go ahead, finish.
Yeah, it's essentially a design system. It's exactly like material design. It's just they give a bit more information for developers, because Ant is primarily used by companies that don't want to create their own design system.
I think, Matthew, what would be cool is maybe at the end, if I can get a list from you for all these tools you showed us, just to give us the name, link, and maybe when or why to use it. I think that would be much appreciated.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, I'll continue to go through the questions. Abu's asking, is Figma free or do you pay monthly for certain features?
Yeah, so Figma is free for a certain amount of projects. So the free version of Figma is very, it's very user-friendly. Like you could get by with it. It really depends on what you do. I have a paid version because of the company, so I have unlimited access. But Figma is free. I just know that it's limited. It's limited in the amount of pages you could create. It's limited in the amount of projects you could open. But it's not limited in the tools. Like you won't be prevented from using certain things. So yeah, and like I said, everything's web-based. You don't have to download the app if you don't want to. You can do everything through the website.
Okay, thanks. Perfect. Diptesh asks, from my understanding, Figma, Adobe Xd, and software like that are only used for prototyping of the UI UX. Is that right? Secondly, why are they referred to as vector-based UX tools?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question, okay? So vector is more related to graphic design. And what vector means is that it's a specific point in the pixel. So I'll go back to Figma to show you guys. And here, I'll open a new project. All right, so if I zoom in, I don't know if you guys see it or not. You see these little boxes? If you do, essentially.
Only when you hover over, otherwise it just looks like a big...
Here, let me try to make this white. You might see it better. No, it doesn't show better.
No, it's actually better. Yeah, now we kind of
see it like this. You guys see like these little lines, these grids? Essentially,
you guys give us a thumbs up if you are seeing it, just to make sure you're... Yeah, perfect.
Essentially what this, it's with the screen share, it's not always very practical, but if ever you open Figma, you'll be able to see them very easily. this represents a point in your screen. It's a pixel, it's a grid. So vector means that I could do anything on any point. So if I want this to bend and stuff like that, that's what it means that it's vector based. When something is not vector based, it's static. So I cannot modify the point that it is. A picture would be a good example of that. So SVGs, so when you download an icon, you could download it in different types. You could download an icon as an SVG. You could download an icon as a JPEG. You can download as a PNG. A PNG JPEG is image-based, so it's static, whereas a vector is customizable. So that's why they call these vector-based tools. Another example of a vector-based tool is Illustrator, Photoshop, Canva. Like if you guys create something on canva.com, those are vector-based tools. It's that you're allowed to modify things on a specific point, a pixel point. So if I were to take this icon and I want it to, actually I would have to detach it. There you go. Sorry. So if I come here and you see all these little points, these are tied to a point in the pixel grid. So if I want this guy to be more here now, and I don't want this to be a circle with a circle in it, and I want it to disappear, this is why it's called vector-based, because it allows you to modify the points in each section. Now, if I were to take something like a text, and I say this is a text, or yeah, let's say this. This is static. I cannot change the points of these. What I could do though is I could flatten it so that it becomes vector-based. That's the term is called flatten. So if I flatten it, it is now a pixel. So you see I have all these different points, and I could modify these points. So if I want this to be like this and like this, I have that option because now it is vector-based and it's no longer text or flat or static, sorry. And then for the second question is, Adobe Xd and software like these are only used for prototyping. I wouldn't say, I would say no. So there's an important thing to mention, okay? Prototyping is what happens when you go from state to state. So I'll give you an example. If I were to, here, let's do a really, really simple version of it. I'll take a screen, phone screen. So let's say I have this phone screen and I want to add this text box here, okay? Actually, this is not a good example. Let me use Ant. There you go. So I use Ant and I want it to be like, I have an avatar, I have my button, that's over here, and yeah, we'll just leave it like this as a really simple version. And then I have another state that once I click on this button, this avatar becomes like, I don't know, let's say bigger. Here, let's make it a color, bigger, large. Or it becomes smaller in this case, okay? So this here is a mockup. This is one artboard, it's a mockup, and this is another mockup. Prototyping is when there's interactions between both. So if I were to say that when I click on this button, you see there's a prototyping option here, that it brings me to this artboard, and I want to view it. So let's say I click on this play and I view it as a prototype. Prototype is like what's almost realistic to what an app would look like. So when I click on this button, it brings me to the next one. That's a prototype. The prototype is the sequence between each page, whereas mockups is the state of each page. Some companies prototype, some companies don't. Us at Swift Connect, we don't prototype. I only prototype for investment purposes. So let's say we need to show something to investors. We need to show something to stakeholders. It's much easier for a designer to create the states and prototype it than ask the developers to create it. So it gives like a more realistic sense of what the application would use and how to use it. But we only use it in states like that. Some companies only prototype or have a prototyping tool, team. So they would have the designer design it, and then they would send it off to their prototypers, and the prototypers would prototype it to make sure the sequence flows properly and stuff like that. But they're two different things. So they're both, you could do both in both tools.
Thank you. Wonderful. So you were basically also creating for yourself a whole bunch of design assets to use on different projects. Makes life easier.
Yeah, like I could show you like really quickly, but you see, these are all different projects, different apps that we use, right? But these all use the same prototype. They all use the same design system. So when I change it one place, it changes everywhere. And you try to use always the same tool. You try to use the same style throughout the whole application. That way, everything looks consistent, and it's easier for the developers and the designer.
Thank you, Matthew. Okay, I'll go to the next question. When starting out as a UI UX designer, should one use Figma or Adobe XD? To me personally, XD feels more user-friendly and very easy. I think you kind of answered that earlier, but this is put in a different way.
Yeah, it really depends on preference. They both are very, very similar. I would say if you I think Figma just has more tools for somebody that's starting, including the community. Like the community is a really, really, really good tool. You come over here, you search what you need. If you need something to do like buttons, let's say I want to get something on buttons. So Explorer, I click on buttons, I do search. It'll give me every file available free on buttons. So this is also really good for designers if they want to get inspiration. There's so many different tools out there for inspiration. One, Behance, Pinterest. You could go on Instagram. You could go on actual websites and look at all these different websites. But community is a really, really good place because you see all these different buttons that were created by all these different designers, and there's over 100 buttons. So you could definitely get the inspiration you need. But what's cool about this too is that you could see how they were built, and this neomorphic style was very popular about 2 years ago. It's this one over here too is neomorphic. It's very hard to create in Figma. It's a very hard style to reproduce. So when you see somebody make it as well as he did over here, it's fun to go look and be like, oh, this is the techniques he used and stuff like that, especially if you're not used to it. So it's also good for learning. That's one of the reasons. Another reason why I enjoy Figma more than XD. Tool wise, they're both the same thing. I would say they're very, very similar. Everything else, I would say Figma's better.
Perfect, thank you. Next question is from Fatime. She asks, is it possible for developers to import a designed app made by designers into the other software?
There's no way to copy paste or import. Like there's no import export because at the end of the day, it's not code. It's not it's vector based. It's not code based. Figma does a really good job at telling you what the CSS looks like and stuff like that. But there's no if the question is there a way to like literally just make the design a product with a quick button? Unfortunately, it doesn't exist. And the reason why is because even if it did exist, there are some apps that allow you to design and code at the same time. Like there's a Webflow is one of them. The issue with those is that, especially in web, there's so many different browsers and so many different screen sizes and resolutions and all these different things that you have to take into consideration that you as a developer, you have to create rules for different experiences. So often these are called media queries. So, if I use if I use Mozilla Firefox, do this. But if I'm using Google Chrome, use this. It sucks that it's like that. But these browsers kind of make up their own rules for certain things, or different updates don't work with certain new technologies. So that's the main reason probably why it'll never exist, because these companies like Figma and Adobe Xd would have to take that into consideration. And it's really, really problematic. Adobe actually a long time ago made a tool called Dreammaker that essentially tried to do that. And the minute that all these different browsers came out, like Mozilla Firefox and Chrome, they had to close the app because it stopped working. It wasn't feasible.
Perfect. Thank you, Matthew. Last question in the chat is, can I import the prototype on the device that I want to show it from Aldo?
Yeah, so Figma has a really good tool called Mirror. So it's on your phone. I don't know if you guys see it. Once you log in, you could mirror your device. You could mirror your design to your devices. So because my product is mobile based as well as tablet and used on browsers, when I design, I have to design for the three devices. So when you design for dev or for web, sorry, it's very easy to just look at a website and test it. But the emulators that are being used for so let's say I come here, like you guys kind of saw it before when I did the share. It shows this type of design type of phone, I guess. This is really practical to see how things are laid out, but it's not practical for use because there's certain rules that you have to follow when it comes to mobile for the size of a button, the size of the size of button considered to a thumb, the size of spacing in between text, click areas and all these things, and you can't really test it. So when you use tools like Figma Mirror, you're able to mirror your actual application, your actual prototypes on your tablet, on your phone, have scrolls and stuff like that, and it works really, really well. So Figma Mirror is the best tool for that. I don't know if Adobe Xd has one though. I wouldn't be able to tell you if they have that.
All right, perfect. Yeah, not to my knowledge either. Anyways, you're more of the expert on that. Actually, there's one more question from Raza. Did the college teach you the design aspect or did you learn it on the job?
Yeah, so before starting at LaSalle, I had a deck in communications, and that's where I had started, let's say, my career. So I already had a type of artistic background. And like I said, I wasn't the best developer, but I always had that, product side of things. So I learned quite a bit by myself. That being said, I learned the fundamentals by myself. But I think if I had somebody like me that was able to mentor me when I was in school or help me or give, just telling me about design systems, I probably would have accelerated my career a bit faster. Now, where I am in my career, I think I'm very blessed for the role I have in my short career span. But I was lucky to have people that taught me what design systems are and how it works and all these tools. And also, I think the documentation and the role of UI UX or product design, however you see it, it has advanced drastically in the last 2-3 years. So the amount of documentation, the amount of exposure is a lot better now than it was a few years back.
Thank you for sharing that, Matthew. Yeah, we tend to focus a lot more in the courses on the coding and development and the back end than truly teaching design. That is something to consider and keep in mind. So do you recommend then taking a course for design systems?
I don't think you need to take a course for design systems because it's kind of self-explanatory in the sense of they're so public. Once you know how a design system works, it's easy to duplicate. What I would recommend you do is that if you want to learn or become a designer, is learn. There's a lot of rules to follow and a lot of little things that are needed to be learned or that you should know as a designer in UI UX. Accessibility is a really big one. That's making sure buttons are accessible or that you're able to see them visually. What happens if I'll give you an example. I worked at Transat. One of my first jobs as a developer was at Transat, the flight company, and they really focused a lot on accessibility. And accessibility has to do with anything with what happens when you press the escape button, what happens when you press space, what happens when you press tab, what's the sequence it follows in your HTML and stuff like that. Those are things that it's good for a designer to know as well. There's a concept called SEO, which is practical. I'm just gonna connect my computer. Sorry, give me 2 seconds, guys. which is practical as a developer. You guys still hear me? Sorry, I don't know if it cut or not.
No, we hear you. It's just you kind of going dark and some shades.
Yeah, I knew that was gonna happen. Do you guys still see my screen, or it's not sharing anymore?
No, we still see your screen.
Great. Okay. So accessibility is one thing that I think you should learn. You know, like design structures and stuff like that. There's really a lot of good books and YouTube pages that you could follow that teach all of these little things, because learning how to use Figma is really, really easy. It's how to, you know, create, you know, the design that's more important. So if you're planning on becoming a designer, that's what I would suggest. Design Systems is a really, really good tool. And you know what? Material design, their documentation is really, really good. And a lot of people focus on just the component section. So if I come here and I just look at the, where is it? If I go to material, they have the design section. So it doesn't talk about the component, it talks about really design and how they use the colors, how they use their fonts, how they use their spacings. That is a really, really good place for you to read, because they give really good detail and documentation of why things are done this way. So that's a good one. Ant also has it in their design. So it seems like Ant's working a bit quicker. But all these like design values, which is like colors and all these different type of things, you know, their layouts, all their cases. These are really good documentation of how a website or a mobile app should be structured. That's more important than design systems, I think.
What you talked about earlier for certain standards in designing, let's say specifically mobile apps, keeping in mind the size of the thumb to click on something, or a finger, and the spacing. Are there standards that are given or set up by default for you to follow, or you kind of have to learn that on your own as you move along?
Yeah, so I think that there's the go-to standards, and then there's the trends. So there's standards that go with like often menus are on the right. If you see a menu on the left. If you see a menu on the right, well, there's a reason why it's not like that. It's because it's been like that for years, because it works. Like you don't don't fix something that's not broken type of mentality. But you know, mobile phones now, there's a lot of like gestures. Gestures are really, really, really popular in mobile phones. They're very practical. You know, pinch to do this, swipe up to do this, etc., etc. So those are like the little standards that are different. But you know, like the amount of padding you have on each side, that's a standard. That hasn't really changed in many years. You know, font sizes, the default, like the smallest you should ever go is 16. If you're building a website like this, you know, it's fine. If you're building a website like a blog, often the font is much, much bigger because you're reading a lot more. I don't know what's a good blog. Does it matter? Here, blog. All right, so if I open this, you see like the text is very big and everything is centered. The reason why is because there's a certain rule that you want to follow, so that you, number one, when people read, they read from left to right, so your eyes go left to right. And you always want to focus in the middle. So if your text starts over here and your text ends over here, your head has to move. And then it's a lot of head movement and nobody wants to read after. Whereas if you keep it in the middle, you're just moving with your eyes. So that's number one. So there's a rule to that. Like you don't want it to be more than 500, I think it's 574 pixels wide. But then as a designer, what's important to know is the responsiveness. Like this is a good example to show you of what could be done. Sorry, do this. Yeah. So if I come here and I make this smaller, you see everything around it changes, but the font only changes at a certain point. So this is what we call responsiveness. So you know, if we look at this website, this section over here, this like header section or the hero image, which is what it's called. There's a hero text and hero image. This is considered to be a component. So whoever HubSpot's developers are, they would have built this as a component. So you see this component responds in a certain way. So when it gets to a certain size, the image disappears. but if not, the image always stays centered. So these are things that as a designer, I would tell my developers. And then I would tell my developers, make sure that this stays this size in the middle and that everything around it gets smaller until a certain size. And it always stays centered because of the way you read. And the reason why it's like this, because this is a very awkward size. Like this size doesn't exist, but they probably have the media query to be tablet. And if people read this on tablet in landscape, it's still the same process. Their phone is closer to their tablet is probably closer than their computer. So they have to read it in a specific way. And you don't want the eyes to carry along. These are little rules that you could find in books. I also learned these with time. One of the things I said at the beginning was, talk to your people, your peers, so you could share knowledge. I learned this from somebody that worked in print. So she started her career as a graphic designer, and she worked in a magazine company. And she's the one, I asked her, how come it's always like this? And she said it's because of the eyes and the way they carry and stuff like that. I learned that 3 years ago, and it's stuck with me, and now I know it as a designer. So some things I learned on the job too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I hope that all these questions are not keeping you from the content. Do I keep going, or do you have something to go back to?
No, I think content-wise, I'm done. I just don't want to forget that question you asked me because it was a good one. I just don't remember it anymore. So hopefully you
I'll
remember
try
it.
to remind you. I'll try to remind you. I have 2 more questions. Every time I think the questions are done, there's more that pop up. But I'm so happy because they're really nice and relevant. So I was wondering, can a person who has studied computer science apply for a UI UX job? All the jobs I have seen require graphic design background.
So some people don't know what UI UX is, but they know they need it. So what happens is that they automatically assume that it's related to graphic design. The thing is that they're never going to ask you, or rarely, like I've never done an interview that they ask me for a graphic design diploma or something like that. What I would suggest is create a portfolio. Behance is a really good place to start. So behance.net, I believe, is a really, really good place to host your designs. It's free. It's you don't have to pay for it, and this is your portfolio. So if I did like UI UX, you would have like a really good example of like a great portfolio of a project. So this is somebody that created their own product. Like Roar Bike is probably not real. It's a case study. They added the description. They added all their personas, use case. A lot of this is really, really good for an interview. These are things that you could learn on your own. So like if you Google what's user persona, you'll figure it out. There's sites that give you fake user personas and fake case studies. User flow. This is very similar to Figma. The FigJam, the thing I was showing you before, you could create user flows in FigJam. Typography, this is tied a bit to, so all these typographies, like these sizes, regular, bold, etc., these colors, this is tied to the design system. They just put it in a different way. Now, this is UX. When you see something that's framework, it's under UX. When you see something that is high fidelity, it's under UI. That's mostly companies combine them together. But if you're technical and if you work for like a big company like Desjardins they separate them into 2 different companies. CAE is another good company that does that. They have a UI team and a UX team. So this is a really, really good example of a very good portfolio. This is very high. This is very high quality. Aspire to get to this. Don't expect for you to do this tomorrow. But these are really good inspirations, and this is a good example of what a portfolio should look like. So Behance is a really good tool to create your own portfolio. And bringing it back to the graphic design part is that you're in design, you're nothing without your portfolio. So if you don't have a portfolio, if you don't have anything to show, it's hard for them to judge you on it. It's hard for them to say, hey, like, you might have 10 years experience in UI UX, but I need to see something. Like talk is cheap, So you could have 0 experience as a UI UX designer, but if you have a really, really good portfolio, you probably have a better chance of somebody that has a really bad portfolio with 2 years of experience, because it means that they learned nothing in 2 years, or they just didn't work on their portfolio. And if your portfolio is good, they won't care about if you have a graphic design degree or not.
Thank you for that, Matthew. That's very true. Another question, I resonate a lot with you, Matthew, when you said that development is not your cup of tea, and I like more of the product and design aspect. Do you have any pro tips to resolve such dilemmas when you wish to learn a bit of both but unsure which industry to work for? PS, I'm a student in game programming.
Yeah. So I would say that I having a foundation as a developer, even if it wasn't the greatest, I learned a lot after school. So I just want to say that you might not resonate to what you're doing in school, but if you get a stage, uh, you're going to learn a lot in your stage, and it's gonna kind of give you that confidence that you probably need. Um, so that's what helped me as a developer. I learned a lot in my stage, and then I was able to get good jobs. And then I made a decision that I wanted to go into design because um, I had the opportunity. One of the jobs I worked at was looking for a designer, and I was already kind of doing some design stuff for them because I kind of like not forced them, but I suggested they let me do it. That's how it started for me. Uh, it's really hard to say if there's another way of doing things. There's like 1,000 ways of getting a job. I'll give you an example. Like I have another person I went to school with. Like she knew once she got out of school, she wasn't going to be working as a developer. She was going to work as a business analyst because that's what she liked, and she was able to find that job right away. So if you don't think you want to work in gaming and you're not liking it, there's still stuff that you learned in gaming that are going to be practical for you as a designer. I can guarantee you that. Just the way things are built, and the way that the gaming prototypes are done, and all the different technologies and stuff like that. Like there's a really big company in Montreal called I'll get the link and I'll share it. They're a really big mobile gaming company in Montreal. They're all over the world, but they have a really big office in Montreal. And I know if you have gaming experience as a developer, it's a really good plus if you're as a designer job there. So understanding how gaming works as a designer, and if you want to go into designing games, that's a really, really, really big plus. Depends on what you want to do. And the other thing too is that UI UX is very general in the term, but every company does it differently. So I'll give you an example. At my role, I'm called the lead product designer. Essentially, what I do is that I'm a product owner that also designs, but I'm essentially the product owner. It's just that I have experience as a designer, and I started as a designer there, so I still design mockups, but I have other designers that design as well. So, maybe at another company, they would never allow that to happen. Maybe at another company, they expect you to do everything. So it depends. I would just say, try learning the standards, try learning the go-tos of design, because whether your UI, UX, product, whatever it is, those standards are never lost. Like those are good things to learn. And start by working on your portfolio, because your portfolio is also going to show you what type of style you like working on. It's going to give you kind of like an identity. It's like what type of style you like. You might like making like really big websites that are very design related, not a lot of text, and it's like very in your face. Or you might like making really simplistic mobile apps. Work on the design, work on the functionality. Like that's really a good place to start. Also, another thing too is that in your prototypes, or sorry, in your portfolios or anything, or whenever you try to design something, when you start in a company, any company that is building a software, they're trying to solve a problem. That's like 90% of companies, that's their goal, is to solve a problem. If you're building a website called Road Bikes, they're probably trying to solve a problem related to bikes. So always try to explain what your problem is and how you're trying to solve it. That goes for front-end developers too and stuff like that. If ever you decide to create your own app, like I don't know, let's say it's like an app on like cats, and if you think the problem is that not enough people know about information about cats, well, that's your problem, and you created a website for it. So that's another good tip I would say is try to solve a problem when you're designing.
Great advice. Thank you. Matthew, next question is, if you get into a company as front end, could you not show them that you have potential to design more? I'm sure once you get into the company, you're able to learn from the others and change paths.
Yeah, so that's what happened to me. Naiman, do you still work with Jesta?
Yes.
So Jesta, I worked there a short period of time between two jobs. I got lucky to work there. I had two colleagues or people that I went to school with that had jobs there, and they asked me to work there as a front end developer. So I went there, and when at Jesta, I realized that they didn't have really a design team. So I suggested, hey, on my spare time, let me work on design stuff. And if you think that it's worth it, and you think that it's valuable for the company, well, let me do it part time or something, and I won't, I'll make sure it works out. They gave me the opportunity, and towards the end, I was doing more design than develop. And then because of that job, because of Jesta, I decided I was going to just change company because I wanted to work on it full time. So yeah, I got lucky. I had that opportunity. I started as a front end developer. I found a problem that they had in the company, and I was the solution, I guess, in a certain sense. I can't promise you every company is like that, but if you're working in a small company that doesn't have a lot of employees, that you wear many hats, which is often the case probably when you start your career, unless you work for like big blockchains, like big companies. You might have to wear many hats. You might have to be a front end developer and a back end developer. You might have to do integration and something else. You might have to do a bunch of different things. I got lucky and was able to do both front end and design until I changed career paths.
Yeah, I think if I can add to that, the thing about Matthew too is that he was very persistent, and he knew what he wanted to get into, so he did work on that a lot to
Yeah,
improve himself and to get better. It's not enough just to like it. You really, really need to brush up on the your skills, learn the technologies, try out different things at your own spare time, so that you can get to a point where you say, I'm good at it. I can go with confidence to apply for those jobs. That's really important.
yeah, and that's a great point. You won't go far with you, like in UI UX. You need a portfolio that's your liking it. That's your like showing that you want these things. And like Nariman said, like from the beginning, I kind of knew, like, come my last year, especially Int was a really good place for me to do that stuff, because I was able to design, the logo. I was able to do like these little illustrations for our projects or our little things. We did a prototype for one of the students. They were in the
The
they're
business,
in
all the students in the business school were coming to us in Int, and they still do till today, to
yeah,
create their mock-up solutions, web solutions. It gives
exactly.
you guys great opportunity to experiment, and that's what Matthew was doing. It was amazing.
That's exactly where it was. Int really helped on that perspective as well. The doors, that the little projects they were able to do. That's how I discovered Adobe Xd. It was literally because I didn't know the tool existed. I knew that what UI UX was. I had an idea. I had an idea of what it was, but I didn't really know what it was until I got into it. And then you realize what it actually is once you get into the work industry. So that's another thing too. Sometimes, like, I'll give you an example. You might think business analysts do something, but a business analyst in one company could do one thing that another company calls a software analyst, which another company calls like a consultant. Like they're so broad that sometimes you kind of like have to look through the lines. But generally, they all do some similar work. And often it's the cases that it's companies don't know what they're looking for, so they assume that it's like, hey, it's this. It's okay. I assume it's this. So yeah.
Okay, great. There's one more question. I think in reference to what you were mentioning earlier, I'm not sure if Matthew, you were talking about Livia,
Yeah, it
about the
was.
business analyst. Okay, so there was a question. Could you tell us more about the path this friend of yours took for the business analyst? I answered them in the chat that she's part of a panel tomorrow, and she does during the interview answer questions about her career path. So maybe they can wait to hear that
And yeah,
tomorrow.
and you know what?
Unless you want to say something about that
No,
as
what
well.
one thing I would say too is that Livia was like she from the beginning became a business analyst. And one cool thing is that Livia and I shared a building when we both worked in Longueuil. So I would have lunch with her often. We didn't work in the same company, but we were both in the same building. Um, Olivia in school was a really, really good developer as well. So she was an excellent
Agreed.
developer. She was very good, and she still went into business analyst because that's what she wanted to do. So that's a good example of somebody that was good and still went into a different career compared to somebody like me that was a bit wasn't as good as her, but still that ended up changing eventually. You know.
But you were both excellent in analysis, and I always told you guys that. I
Yeah.
think when you have a very good eye for analysis and being able to break down the project into pieces and parts and understand that whole experience and the effect of properly done features on the client's, again, experience, it allows you to be able to learn and adapt to whatever you want to do. So make sure you guys really work on your analysis skills, your problem solving skills, because those can get you far regardless which path you decide to pursue.
Yeah. If you're good at problem solving, you'll be a very good developer as well. It doesn't only have to do with product. And I would say that if like if in a traditional company, it's usually the way it is that you have your product owner, they tell you what the product is, and then the UX and UI team already know what the product is. They just go and create it. They're not solving much problems. The product owner, business analyst, all those people did that already. Whereas when you're a front end developer or a developer in general, you have your own type of problems to solve because often your code won't be as black and white as you think it is. So I think problem solving actually applies more. It's very good for designers, but it's also very good for developers as well. And you'll probably use it earlier in your career compared to designers.
I think you kind of just answered the question I asked you earlier. I said, how does the collaboration happen to kind of arrive at that final design? Uh, I understand that it's in collaboration with the product owner through discussions and stuff like that. But how do you, for example, showcase something in the beginning with a
Yeah.
prototype? Or do you wait till you have a better understanding, then you start designing the interfaces?
So it's really it. I wouldn't say my company is a very traditional way of doing things because of uh, yeah, it's not traditional. But the thing is that it's because I don't think traditional is traditional anymore. I think companies are just doing their own way, and they're realizing that they might need some roles that they combine into one person depending on who that person is. So it's very hard to say. I would say the go-to way. Let's say if we're talking about like really big companies, I'll tell you how. Let's say Transat did it. Okay, Transat was the idea or the demand came from the stakeholders. So stakeholders could be the bosses, the CEO, the shareholders, the investors, the potential clients. Um, those are the stakeholders, the people that are paying for what you're doing. Then the product owner and the project manager work together to find out what is a priority and what isn't. So the project manager manages the project to make sure that everything is working smoothly and everything is advancing correctly. And then the product owner is able to determine what could be done in a certain point, and they understand the product heavily. There's also the Scrum Master that could be involved in this, which is another role. But Scrum Masters, in a very simple term, are there to facilitate the developers in their work. They want to make sure there's no problems, and they remove any roadblocks you have. So let's say those are the three people that usually meet together. They determine what the backlog would look like. So your project management tool, what the tasks are for that sprint. If you're working in an agile methodology, if it's waterfall, it's different. But it's very similar. Like some people do hybrids and stuff like that, but essentially it's that they tell you what the tasks is. The product team, though, knows what the tasks are a few weeks before the developers know so that they could work on it and have it ready for the developers. So it's very rarely on the same level. So me as a developer, as a designer, I try to have my designs 2 to 1 month ahead of what the developers need to do. Because if ever there's modifications that have to be done and there's roadblocks, there's something that changed in the future because of X reason, the backend is not ready yet, etc., blah, blah, blah. I have enough time to modify my designs so that it doesn't impact the developers. So that's usually the flow. I would say it starts with the stakeholders and the project manager and whoever the management is. The product the product owner determines what could be done with the project manager. They figure it out with the Scrum Master. The tasks are then given to the designers. The designers create those tasks. They are then either sent back to the Scrum Master or the team leads of the developing teams to write up the tickets to make sure that they're technical and no longer product based, because you technically, if there's like different APIs to call or different developing tools that they should use or whatever, they do that, and then it's given to the developers. The developers code it. It's given to the QA team. The QA team tests it. Once it's all done, it's put into a staging environment. Often it's the test to make sure it's actually functional, it's working, it's not breaking the website. Once that's done, it's passed all those tests, then it goes into production, which is the final output.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Matthew. I don't know if you have still time to take more questions, or do you have to?
I have 3 minutes. Yeah, I have a meeting at 5, so I have a hard cutoff at 5, unfortunately.
Okay, no, I mean, if you need to prepare, it's up to you. There was
no. It's with an employee, so don't worry about it. I could even run a bit later. It's not the end of the world.
Okay, there was one more question. How do you get along with Scrum in your company to avoid falling into the traditional models?
So I think Scrum is used by a lot of companies. It just, so there's a very famous saying, is that I'll try to say it properly. It's that companies are very agile, but they're not Scrum. So what that means is that they're very they're very loose with the way that they use Scrum and stuff like that. So some people say they use Scrum, but they're actually in waterfall. What's important is not the way that the methodology is done, because we technically at Swift Connect, we try to use Scrum, but sometimes we fall into waterfall, or a lot of things like go down, like they just go to the next sprint and they fall in. I wouldn't worry about what that is. I would worry about making sure your tasks are done in that time frame, and if it's not, being open. So another thing too is that before any task is done by a developer, there's a grooming session. They make sure that they have enough time, or they determine what the story points are and how complicated something will be. And then once that's determined, then they're able to see what falls into the velocity of a team. So if a team velocity is 70, well, they make sure that they fit in 70 points worth, that they don't go over, they don't go under, and you take into consideration QA and stuff like that. I personally don't work on velocity. I work on project-based. There's there's a feature that could take me 5 minutes to do something, and there's a feature that could take me 3 days. It really depends. That's why I work so in advance, because I don't want to. It's hard for me to determine how long my designs are going to be, depending on what the product is. So I think Scrum is traditional. If you ask me, I think most companies in Montreal and around the world use Scrum.
Yeah, it's now become the new old.
Yeah.
The new way we do things. Please, would you make available the list of suggested resources as mentioned before? Yes, don't worry. I will reach out to Matthew. I kind of already wrote down a lot of the stuff he mentioned: Figma, Foop, Figma Jam, Storybook, Netlify, Design System, Figma Mirror, HubSpot for blogs, Behance.net. So maybe this way, Matthew, if there's anything you forget, I'll remind you from the tools I wrote down, and then you can give us a breakdown of that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And look, if people want to add me on LinkedIn and have questions, I'll be more than happy to help you and answer questions.
I tagged you in a post on purpose so that they can easily find you.
Yeah, and what I'll do actually, if you want, I'll make this. I'll share the presentation. So I'll either send it. I'll either send it as a Figma file so that they could actually explore Figma, or we'll find a solution. But I'll add all the links in there as well, and I'll keep it hosted so that people could use it. And I'll send you that link.
That would be great. And maybe you can promise me to do another workshop like that in the winter or next Tech Week. I think we would like to see more. One topic that would be interesting to also bring up that for them might be important is also how long did it take you to start estimating how long your tasks would take compared to before. This is something that is also on their mind a lot. They ask about that. So
Sure. Yeah, it's
all
great.
right. All right. Thank
Thank
you
you,
so
everybody.
much, Matthew.
I hope you enjoyed
Take
it.
care. Have a great evening. We loved it. It was a pleasure to have you, and we look forward to having you again in the future. You're getting tons and tons of thanks. If you have time to read all of them, that would be amazing. Everybody is grateful, and really you helped clarify a lot of contents. Wow, look at that. We're very proud of you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it. It's very nice of everybody. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you. You too. Have a good night. Thank you,
You too.
everyone.
Bye.
So we'll see you tomorrow morning. Good luck with your meeting, Matthew. And
Thank you.
we'll see you all tomorrow morning to continue with other workshops. Thank you.
Bye, guys. Take care.
Bye, Matthew. Good night. All right. Great. Thank you, everyone. This is really, really wonderful feedback. I'm so happy to hear that. It allows us to figure out in the future to have more workshops as well of that sort. So good night, everyone. Take care.